Hello.
Hey, Roger. How's life, etc.?
Rich.
Rich?
How's life for you?
In terms of many things, it's quite rich. I agree. I don't know, lots of conversations with people, this thing, that thing. We seem to be having a rich array of discussions, discourses, all those kind of nice things.
Yeah, I've been striking gold in many respects in my reading. I'm a little disappointed in this book. The new metaphysical foundations of modern science.
Oh, who wrote it?
It's from the Noetic Sciences. It's an omnibus collection of essays. The keynote paper and major editor is Willis Harman.
Don't know him. Yeah, so it's coming from a different perspective, huh?
Yeah, no, it's got some. Well, I described it this morning as it went from rot and smelly mess to brilliant gold. So it's like the lotus in the swamp.
Yeah.
You know, in the course of in one page, I wrote a frowny face next to one of his points. Like, I'm really angry about this one. And then turn the page, read another paragraph, and bing, I just lit up. There's a section I love and I want to include in the course. So it's.
Can you show me the name again? Let me record it. I want to write it down.
Willis Harman. The name is the metaphysical. I'll get you something that's more readable.
Okay. Hi, Charlotte. Hi, Whitney.
Hello. Hello.
I think that is more readable.
New metaphysical foundation. Oh, nice. Jane Clark. Jane Clark's rings a bell. Did we read any of her stuff?
No.
No.
He was apparently an editor and for the Noetic Sciences Institute.
Mm.
And he got more and more engaged in the proceedings of a conference, and that's what gave rise to this book.
Okay.
But I'm struggling with some of it, Stephen. I'd love to be able to talk about it.
So right now, my problem is I'm in love with this book by Helen Longino, and I mistakenly or not, it's my gold standard for how to engage in an understanding of these kind of things, with its emphasis on the kind of assumptions that we have and how we tend to see things through our assumptions and things like this. It seems to kind of bring together so many important trends. I think it's even relevant for this discourse about religions and so on and so forth. So I tend to be too positive about Longino and kind of wonder, do people understand these kind of distinctions?
I like it a lot. It's a book, I actually want to read it if I can 2 more times before our course starts in August, and basically incorporate some of it into the course, but it has to be done in, how do I put it, more accessible language that Gino uses, but I really would like it to.
Little bites.
Yeah, little bites, yeah. But it's a fantastic book. It really is. I think it's a great book. Yeah.
So Robert and I submitted a proposal to ABS.
Well, you did already?
Yep.
Yeah,
Oh,
well, it's
deadlines.
due. It's due April the 1st.
Yeah.
So we got it into almost the last minute.
You may be called in as a character witness, Todd. Please be kind.
Right. Yeah. Just say that we're decent people. That's all.
We don't swear more than 2 or 3 times a sentence.
Right.
Oh, good.
A session or a sentence?
A sentence, a
A
sentence.
sentence, okay.
I,
So what's
Robert
your-
Saraceno, do solemnly swear. No, anyway.
What's your proposal?
It was based on Johnny's question on like
An
how-
intelligent design. He said to buy support intelligent design.
Oh, good.
And we just ripped off of that. It turned out that it opened up a whole set of
Yeah.
interesting questions.
Good.
And then I'm
came
going
from,
to
I'm sorry.
represent I'm also going to try to represent the same one I did about 4 years ago on hermeneutics of passages around science, on digging for deeper gold. So I'm going to update that and give it
It
again.
came from a criticism that Johnny got from someone that, well, if you believe in an intelligent designer, then you must believe in intelligent design. And he said, well, no, those are two different things. But so he asked if we could have a special session on that. And so that's what led to our decision to write this,
Yeah, it's interesting to ask why we can support intelligent design in terms of the universe as a whole and dispute it when it comes to evolution.
Mm.
Why is that so? And it's not that the process of evolution as a whole doesn't reflect intelligent design. It does. But in the details, which is where ID theory focuses, that turns out to undermine science, which is corrupting of our influence of empiricism. So
And
it,
one thing
it
we
must be
plan to-
wrong.
Yeah. And one thing we plan to say at the end is based on what we're learning from Longino, that at the end we want to sort of say, although not in a dogmatic sense, but say that the background assumption that there is an intelligent designer is something which will help, which was necessary for an ever advancing civilization, and therefore is a background assumption which in the long term can help science itself.
Well, and
scientists make that.
will ultimately be necessary for understanding humanity,
Yeah.
and therefore
that-
ultimately for understanding the natural world, which we're part of.
Yeah. So that's what we're going to conclude with in this paper.
So
Small scope.
I think we better segue from, what did you say, intelligent or industrial design? I mean,
Intelligent design. By the way, we came up with a proof that there's intelligent life in the universe today.
You did?
Yeah, we can prove that there's intelligent life out there. They prove they're intelligent by not contacting us until we're mature.
Oh yes, right. Yeah, right.
Because if they were intelligent, they would have nothing to do with us.
Right.
We'll wait till COVID's over.
Okay.
And morally
I'm sorry.
intelligent as well.
So has that met the standards of Baha'i Review? So Whitney, we better
Better we jump in while we have a moment, huh? Okay. Would someone like to say an opening prayer? I could certainly use a prayer today.
Sure, I'll say one.
Thank you.
I'll say one as well. This will be a short one.
Okay.
Go
God.
ahead, Charlotte. Oh.
Dispel all those elements which are the cause of discord and prepare for us all those things which are the cause of unity and accord. O God, descend upon us heavenly fragrance and change this gathering into a gathering of heaven. Grant to us every benefit and every food. Prepare for us the food of love. Give to us the food of knowledge, and bestow upon us the food of heavenly illumination. In your hearts, remember these things. Abdul Baha.
O my God, aid thou thy servant to raise up the word and to refute what is vain and false, to establish the truth, to spread the sacred verses abroad, reveal the splendors, and make the morning's light to dawn in the hearts of the righteous. Thou art verily the generous, the forgiving.
Thank you so much. Robert, whenever you say that prayer, I can tell it's one of your favorites. I remember one year when I was teaching preschoolers, at Baha'i school, and we learned, everybody memorized that prayer with
Oh,
him.
really?
Anyway, so
Oh, wow.
it totally brings back all those little
Yeah.
tiny kids who are adults now doing their little hand signals. It was very pleasant.
Hi, Andres.
Hi, Andres.
Hi, Andres.
Hi, everybody. Good to see everyone.
Okay, so we left off with toward the end of chapter 5 last week, and we were going to talk about Todd's the tension Todd noticed between chapter 4 and chapter 5, and I think that's where we should begin. Should we begin there? Is that okay with everyone? Is that okay with you, Todd? The person I'm handing it over to.
It is. So I think I just want to point out that, and just building on Stephen's comments as I came in, I think honestly of all the philosophers of science, sociologists of science that I've read, that Longino for me is the most impressive. I can say that even like when we were reading Oresky's this past summer, a number of us, in my mind, Oresky's doesn't really go much beyond what Longino accomplished quite a while ago. And even though Oresky's has really valuable ways of putting a lot of these this thinking, but this book and then Longino's follow-up book, The Fate of Knowledge, I think really does take it as far as it's gone so far, as far as I understand it, in terms of the philosophy of science and understanding. We can correlate a lot of this thinking with what the writings are saying about being in a learning mode and about consultation and that sort of thing. So I just really want to preface my subsequent comments with the notion that I really do feel that she's accomplished a tremendous amount in the philosophy of science. And then the second qualification is that we haven't yet gotten to chapters 9 and 10, which in my mind help to round out some of the thoughts that are in chapters 4 and 5. So with those qualifications in mind, I just really want to emphasize or have these qualifications in mind when I provide the following thoughts. And again, these are just some thoughts of mine that I've had ever since I read this book. So chapter 4 is, and I'm just going to give very, very sort of a surface thoughts because I don't want to take a lot of time. But as you know, chapter 4 is very much about what it means to achieve objectivity, what it means to check individual assumptions and the processes that need to be put into place in order to achieve the greatest level of objectivity possible, while ensuring that individual understandings of scientific results don't hold sway. And she gives a number of parameters that need to be put into place in order to facilitate that. The primary theme of which is intersubjectivity and allowing for a diversity of criticism. And she refers to transformative criticism. And that transformative criticism is achieved primarily through allowing for a democratic approach to the scientific process that enables diversity of checking and of results. And in that way, enabling background assumptions to be scrutinized when scientists are relating the evidence with their hypotheses. So that, as you know, that chapter is very much about the relationship between hypotheses and evidence and the background assumptions that come into play when scientists are engaged in matching those. And then as a consequence, there's a need for the scrutiny of those background assumptions to ensure that certain evidence isn't theory laden, or to the extent possible, the theory ladenness is scrutinized and accounted for. So that's really a critical assumption, and in my mind, or a critical conclusion, and in my mind that relates, as we talked about, to the importance of a consultative epistemology, for example. And we've talked at how the consultative approach can actually take it beyond where Longino has actually taken it, insofar as it creates conditions for that transformative criticism to take place in a much more perhaps effective way. But then we get into chapter 5, and in my understanding, chapter 5 is very much about how values themselves, societal values, influence the way in which the entire scientific enterprise is conducted. And that those values themselves provide a framework that largely determine the types of questions that can actually be asked in a reasonable way within the scientific enterprise itself, and the types of answers that are considered to be appropriate answers, again, within the entire context of the scientific enterprise. And so that sort of then leans more towards, in my understanding, what Thomas Kuhn was talking about in terms of an overall paradigm of the scientific enterprise and what's considered to be scientific. And this largely determined by the socio and economic conditions of that society. It can influence the values that sort of come into play. So at that level, you start to lose the emphasis on diversity. So it's almost as if the diversity that takes place in chapter 4 is within this overarching context of the values that she's talking about in chapter 5. And in both chapters, she's talking about how these are checks on the individual subjectivity or the individual biases that can come into play. So for example, as we know in chapter 5, she gives examples of how there's this mechanistic approach within science, within a certain social historical situation, that teleology is taken out of the equation, and that in fact teleology can't actually play a part in terms of the types of questions that are asked and the types of answers that can be given. So right there, that particular diverse perspective doesn't figure into what constitutes the scientific process. So the tension that, just to summarize, the tension there is that diversity works within a certain context. But if you're outside that context, that diversity no longer works anymore. So I think part of what we have to grapple with is whether or not we accept that diversity within that particular context of overarching values, or whether or not that's in fact a contradiction. And for me, it's particularly important because of questions like teleology and the importance of teleology and how that can inform the scientific process. And there might be other, ways in which we can ask questions that are actually valid to the scientific process, but are not necessarily allowed given the overarching values that society has at a certain time. Now, again, I really want to emphasize that I think that a lot of this will come up again especially when we talk about ideology in chapter 10. And I think in chapter 9, it gets into it as well. So it might be premature to be talking about this tension, but anyway, for what it's worth, that's where I see some of the tension at this point.
I think that's fascinating. Let's have some, okay. Is it Robert and then Stephen?
I think Stephen first.
Okay, Stephen and then Robert.
I think this is a very important question, but I don't fully understand it correctly. On one hand, chapter 4 talks about a diversity of perspectives that are brought to bear. And in another sense, chapter 5 talks about how science is done immersed in certain kinds of worldviews, these kind of things, which tend to limit how people can see things. Do I have that right so far, Todd? And then the question is, how do we mesh these two things? If science is necessarily done within the confines of a certain worldview, that seems to have fixed the assumptions, and scientists are remarkably reluctant to let other people interfere with their evaluation of data or things like this. So you can easily see the kind of constraints that people put on how science is done. On the other hand, science has such, here's my reply. On the other hand, science has such tremendous influence that people want to map, it's almost passive. People want to map a whole bunch of metaphysical assumptions. And I would say the assumption that that's non-theological is just one of those metaphysical games that people like to play. You know, obviously, I was, as a physicist, I could say, obviously, evolution is teleological, regardless of what anybody says about it. I mean, people are giving metaphysical interpretations. Now, metaphysical interpretations then are part of that worldview and feedback. So the question, I guess, becomes, how do you break the hold of a certain worldview without doing injustice to the science? Is that a correct way to kind of grasp it?
Should we go to Robert, or did you want Todd to reply?
Oh, better let all the questions go, right? Let's let everybody ask questions, then Todd can reply to everybody.
Okay, sounds good. Robert.
Well, can I just say that I'm not want this to be set up as me, like it's just a discussion. So I definitely have things to say, but I don't want this to be beyond a discussion. Yeah.
Okay. Sorry, I was kind of pulled off. Stephen was so tactfully saying, "Have I got this right, Todd?" And so then I
don't know if I got it right.
So
we're trying to figure out Todd's perspective here.
Yes. Okay, Robert.
So I really would like to talk. The main thing I'd like to discuss is what I take to be your main point, which is that if society has a worldview, an overarching worldview, then does diversity then not serve? Does diversity work against science? But before I do that, though, you mentioned teleology several times. What does teleology have to do with it? I'm not sure the context which you were saying, talking about teleology. I'm not sure what that has to do with. I mean, yeah, I'm not sure what that has to do with
Longino specifically points to teleology as problematic for the scientific worldview.
Okay. So if somebody holds a view that there is teleology, but then well, there's teleology and there's teleology. I mean, like, is the do the conservation laws have a teleology within them? Well, no, they don't, because they're two-way. The second law of thermodynamics, can you introduce teleology that way? Yes, you can. Or are you talking about teleology in the sense that we are destined to create an ever-advancing civilization? That's a whole different kind of teleology, like science must advance. The science will advance. We will discover more and more. That's a type of teleology connected with the enterprise of science, not whether there's teleology within nature. It's a different question. No.
Yeah, the question of teleology within nature is, I think, what's excluded.
Yeah, okay.
But we can talk about spiders' webs. but we better not get too tangible about the fact that there's a purpose in them. Right?
So, yeah, okay, so the issue though of, okay, so the issue of, well, within the context of the overarching paradigm, then diversity is valuable because we get a lot of different points of view. Okay. It seems to me that societies themselves over a long period of time get locked into a particular paradigm and cannot, from a Baha'i perspective, the society cannot get out of that overarching paradigm until a new manifestation of God comes. So the Greeks were locked into, we can look back at the Greeks who were locked into certain paradigms which they could not get out of until Christ came. And then Christianity brings a whole new type of thing. So as an example, the Greeks had some kind of perception that things are conserved in some way. But they had no idea what. So for instance, how do you measure quantity? Well, cloth is measured in yards. Gold is measured in weight. To talk about a pound of cloth is nonsensical because you don't measure cloth by weight. So how do you pack a ship when it's traveling? Well, it'll take so much gold or so much cloth or some combination of this. You don't think in terms of, things are, oil is measured in volume, not by weight. You don't measure, so the Greeks had this sort of idea, somehow things are conserved. Things can change yet remain the same. Not until Christianity came in did the concept of mass actually come into existence. So with the manifestation of God comes a whole new way of thinking. And with Muhammad, I think modern science really comes out of the revelation of Muhammad. So suppose you have unusual people who can perceive that the whole society needs a new paradigm. If they express that, will it be detrimental to the science of the day, or will it be a jolt or a jog, which will help the society evolve? So I think that's the big question, whether that can happen. So suppose you had a prophet type person, prophetic type person, not a who in the time of Plato and Aristotle said, well, actually, there's something like weight is somehow conserved. Could that have jolted Greek science in a certain way as to help the society discover something new later, rather than being a complete outcast? So he's not scientific at all. Kick him out. Exile him to Cyprus or to Crete, where a volcano will blow him up or something. Anyway.
Are you addressing the psychological or practical or philosophical impact of ideas, Robert? Is that what?
Well, yeah. So we have an idea of what science is. We're really locked into that. So, and if somebody comes along and says X, Y, Z, and we say, well, that's not even a scientific question. But the person can argue that, well, yes, actually, this is a scientific question. And I'll tell you why. He might be an outcast, or she might be an outcast, but it would jolt our way of thinking, I would think.
Okay. Roger, you want to go?
Well, I don't know. Should I let Todd step in for a minute? Okay. So my thoughts, I happen to be reading in parallel a whole series of texts on the history of race and racism and the idea of race. And it emerged around the same time as the idea of science. So when you're talking about the strengthening of science through, I guess what I'm hinting towards is trying to unify or reconcile the tension that Todd has identified. On the one hand, you're talking about science, which is strengthened through a reawakening of diversity of viewpoints. And on the other hand, we have to look at society growing up in a society, science growing up in a society where the suppression of points of views was essentially invented in a new way and became influential. It wasn't until there was a burgeoning middle class and widespread literacy that the question of diversity of views and the contention of ideas was very meaningful. And that's precisely the background for the Enlightenment and the birth of capitalism and mercantilism, et cetera, et cetera. So it's not an accident, it's a historical necessity, perhaps, I'm speculating, that the focus of the natural sciences involved a narrowing of points of views in order to be successful, and that was a restraint on the diversity of the people that was able to be achieved in part because of a restraint on the diversity of the people working in it. And that now, at an age when science may be growing past that, it's also an age in which democratization and multiculturalism is emergent in a new way, globally. An age when humanity is coming of age. So that's my thought when I think that science and racism were invented in pretty much the same milieu. And racism is primarily about stifling the effective diversity of who gets to set the cultural flow and the social, who gets to exercise social power.
Okay, I think Todd's next.
Yeah, I think that I actually agree with what's being said. So there's sort of two different levels here. One is my perceived tension in this book, and then there's also the more general ways of understanding what's happening. So I think the main thing for me is that in chapter 5, there's an argument that the particular worldview that informs science, informs the direction of science, is socially constructed. It's a socially constructed worldview that emerges out of the social conditions and the economic conditions, and that those conditions influence the conception of what it means to be engaged in a scientific enterprise, and by extension, what types of scientific questions make sense to ask, and what answers, what are considered to be appropriate answers to those particular questions. And that's all influenced by this social and economic situation that society is in. So that, in a sense, restricts the diversity of questioning that is actually allowed to take place in order for science to proceed. So then the question then becomes, well, why is diversity stopped at that level? It's sort of like the diversity can operate within the context of that overarching worldview, but the diversity can't actually question that overarching worldview. Now, a lot of arguments can be made to say that worldview, as you're saying, I think, Roger, has allowed science to actually proceed to a large extent. But I'm looking at the argument that Longino is making about the importance of diversity for checking background assumptions and where those background assumptions actually stop. Do they stop at the level of this overarching worldview that has been informed by the social and economic conditions? Or can they actually go beyond that and question that overarching worldview? So that's my main question about the potential conflict that's within her argument. And then secondly is I would also suggest that the diversity is important at that level of the overarching worldview, because the mechanistic notion that has driven the scientific process, while it's been very fruitful, can also be argued to be not sufficient, that there's actually more to the scientific mindset that can be built in from the teleological perspective, which is what she brought up, and which is why I brought it up myself. You know, if you go back to Aristotle, that's very much there. And one could argue that we actually lost something by moving away from Aristotle's perception of reality more towards this mechanistic notion. But at the same time, again, I really want to emphasize recognizing that certainly science has made tremendous progress grounded in this mechanistic worldview. That's not to be argued with. It's just whether or not it could be actually benefit from building in these other aspects, which entails some diversity of input, which perhaps is not allowed by this overarching worldview. I hope I'm making sense. But,
Yeah. Yes, and yes.
Okay, I'm gonna go next, then Farhad, and then Robert. I'm not sure if I've got it all linked to the larger discussion, but I was just kind of prompted by Roger saying that the creation of the notion of race was in order to stifle diversity. And I just kind of noticed that, well, actually the creation of the notion of race created diversity.
Oh, yeah.
No, it created a diversity of experience before
it created the power structures that allow for exploitation.
Exactly. Yeah. So it
invents diversity in order to actually stifle the number of participants.
Yes. Yeah. And so I was going to suggest that maybe, you know, another dimension of this is that it's I think the creation of race and the creation of that form of diversity was really just an expression of lower nature, that it was the expression, it was an invention that facilitated greed and the creation of in-groups and out-groups. And, you know, maybe that's a dimension that we could bring, that could be usefully brought into this discussion too, that, you know, that's there too. People enjoy being in in-groups and find it challenging to work with out-groups. And so, you know, I think it's always challenging to embrace true diversity. Maybe this is this tension that we're talking about, that you know, maybe we as scientifically involved people or philosophically involved people are really happy with kind of a, you know, a diversity of maybe national background, or a diversity of ethnic background, or a diversity of class background, as long as everybody continues to present papers and arguments in the scientifically recognized forms. Whereas maybe someone who doesn't speak in that way is easily dismissed because they're in our out group. Okay, leave it there. Farhad, and then Robert.
Yeah, I think the point that she was trying to make is that these worldviews or paradigms or frameworks exist, and you know, that there is some benefit to them, but that they should always be questioned just as much as the hypothesis within that paradigm is being questioned or tested. So I don't think she's arguing that there's a level that you go to that you should stop asking questions, beyond that. I think she's saying, you should question those things, and whether that questioning is improved or how you can improve that degree of questioning. One of the ways is through diversity, but the more important aspect is that the questioning occurs. How you achieve that, and diversity is one way of achieving that. But I don't think she's arguing that should ever stop.
Okay, Robert.
Yeah, well, there are two things I'd like to talk about. I'll just talk about one now and then the other one later. But along the lines of what Roger was saying, I thought it was kind of interesting, because if you think about it, or as I see it, the 15th century, for instance, was a world of really incommensurable knowledge systems. I don't see how the scientific revolution could have taken place if there was a huge diversity. So, for instance, to become a learned person in China is not going to qualify you to work in the European world, or to become a learned person within the Islamic tradition of the Near East, of Iran and so on. Like a person who becomes really well versed in the proper learning of either China or Iran could not operate in Europe. Now today we have one knowledge system all over the world. So no matter where you're educated in basically the same knowledge system. You can function in the world. You can function scientifically. You can function, for all the diversity in the world. You can function anywhere. You go to any university anywhere in the world. You can then go to any other university anywhere in the world, or any country, and you can be a functioning, valuable person. So there is something to be said for a stage in which culturally there had to be cultural limitations. And as abhorrent as racism is, in a way, racism helped the Europeans say, we don't care about what the Chinese know. We're going to proceed with what we know. We don't care about the Muslim world. We're going to go ahead with developing our own science, which is, so that, and of course there's chauvinism in that as well. So that was one thing I wanted to say, but there's something else I'd like to say, but I'll wait and say it a little bit later.
Okay, Stephen?
Quick comment about reductionism, its power in physics and other kind, and maybe chemistry, and then how it's kind of affected the worldview that's predominant these days, or well, in the secular West. Reductionism is a mode of thinking about cause and effect, about mechanical ways of things affecting each other, so on and so forth. That works extremely well in physics. It's very, very powerful. And it tends to work reasonably well in chemistry, except you can't go very far with it. Chemistry is too complicated. Biology kind of tries to impose reductionism in its ideas of how things evolve. And then social sciences, if they try to impose reductionism, end up with people as little robots and so on and so forth. So there's a kind of an influence flowing back and forth between these different kinds of fields. Sometimes they go one way, sometimes they go another way. I would say in the modern day world, with this tendency to try to replace Christianity worldview of laws with a kind of mechanical worldview, trying to explain everything, you get a kind of reductionistic sense of how the world works from physics, and you assume that it applies everything else. And that's how you construct that worldview is not necessarily correct, nor is it necessarily long-lived. It's under attack. So I would say that if we think of science as describing not only the physical universe, but the soul and into the world of the mind and everything like this, then you end up with this kind of modern worldview. But that's not intrinsic to the science. And it kind of works with the science. You want to explain biology. Schrodinger wants to explain biology by coming up with little DNA particles or things like this. But it's not intrinsic to the science. So I would say that there's a looseness, a considerable looseness between the worldviews that survive in the world around us and the worldviews of science. And if you look at someone who canvasses the thinking scientists around the world, it's only in the West that we hold to this highly reductive worldview. So there's plenty of scientists in the world and they don't necessarily think the way Westerners do.
Robert?
So I wanted to I'd like to look at it this way. And mankind can never go beyond what the manifestation of God has created. So we can deviate from it in a pathological way. So the manifestation of God can create something, we can just go off the rails. We can also fail to develop it within our own capacity, but we can never go beyond that. And so Baha'u'llah has created a world in which universal diversity will contribute to the advancement of civilization. Okay. Muhammad did not create that kind of a world. And modern science comes out of Islam. It's a product of Islam, developed in a part of the world that despised Islam, that despised Muhammad, but still it developed, it came out of that. And so, the world Muhammad created, the kind of what Muhammad created was not one, you had to believe in a certain way in order to contribute to the advancement of civilization. That's as I see it. So the rules today are different from what the rules were 300 years ago, as I see it. Okay, I don't want to make too much of a thing of it because you can always find exceptions. But the rules today are that whatever brings unity is true. That is truth. Whatever brings unity. Whatever brings disunity is false. So if Steve and I argue about quantum mechanics versus relativity, we're both wrong, right? But which we wouldn't do anyway, because we have deep respect for each other. So
Robert, relativity is based on quantum mechanics.
Like I say, if I argue, then that makes you wrong, and I don't want to do that. I want you to be right, so I'm not going to argue. Anyway, but as I say, so we can never, we are bound by the worldview which is created by the manifestation of God, and we can't go beyond that.
Robert, before we go to Roger, can I ask you what you meant by Baha'u'llah created a world of universal diversity?
Well, yeah, he's created a world in which the diversity of the entire human race is necessary for the advancement of civilization. That's not the world Muhammad created.
I see.
So.
Yeah. Okay.
So, we cannot, our civilization cannot advance until every single culture, way of thinking in the world contributes to it. Whereas the world Muhammad created was a world in which, a few people get it right and they can push civilization forward, and everyone else is going to have to play catch up, but that's not the world Baha'u'llah's created.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. Roger? Oh, you're muted, Roger. There we go.
Yeah, I think that my summary statement is that the two questions answer each other. That to answer your question, your bigger question, Todd, is that yes, the diversity can affect the deeper worldview as well. We're watching the slow progress of the recognition of a need for diversity in the framework of the scientific and the philosophy of science. And it's being addressed at the level of background assumptions first. It's being addressed at the rules of evidence and stuff first. But it eventually goes to the point where it affects the whole mechanistic worldview. And it can break out in detail before it breaks out systemically in the whole worldview. And so that's the connection between the small questions and the huge questions. And we're headed into that process now. But humanity was not ready. The need was not clear, as Robert points out. It wasn't even possible, spiritually or intellectually or philosophically, in the past. But now, when science and technology has helped create a world where we're faced and forced to live with, to understand our limitations and our impact on the natural world, and reinvent a more holistic approach to those things instead of having the view that, well, we can just manipulate nature. We have to realize we're manipulating something we're part of. Those three trends all come together, and it's not coincidental. Our capacity to see the thirst for a deeper science that embraces the whole, while not abandoning the power of the science that notices the particular of the material, is precisely attuned to our need for an understanding of humanity or a reinvention of humanity that's universal, which, as Robert points out, is the gift of Baha'u'llah and the challenge Baha'u'llah puts in us to answer.
Thank you. Todd, and then me.
So I think all these comments are, like, for me, they're right on. And so part of, I think, what we can be doing is seeing how what we're saying not only correlates with what Longino is saying, but how it goes beyond what Longino is saying. Because I hear a lot of what you're saying is going beyond what Longino is saying. So it's, she's like, what she's offering is a wonderful launch pad for thinking about the significance of what we're trying to accomplish, like in terms of the harmony of science and religion, in terms of how we go about building a world civilization and how we conceive of science itself. So anyway, I just wanted to say that yeah, for me, a lot of the tension that I perceive here is reconciled by these comments that you're making, but I don't find it in what she's saying precisely. So that's so I just want to say that's very helpful. And I think another part is to think very concretely about, you know, how we think about the conceptual framework that the House of Justice is helping us to think through and understand. And as we read about it in, say, in book 13.2 on social action, where the entire book 13.2 is helping us to understand the elements of a conceptual framework. In my mind, that book, it very much correlates with what Longino is saying, but it also takes it to another level in terms of thinking about it, what a conceptual framework can look like and how it correlates this grand worldview with a diversity of understanding as well.
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to go next then, Stephen. I'm sort of dancing around the idea that maybe diversity has sort of a natural limitation on the amount of diversity that we have. I'm thinking about, for example, language diversity. You know, in the writings that Baha'u'llah calls for everyone learning a second language, but there's also indications in the writings that eventually we'll have one language, one common language. And, you know, I think as the world becomes globalized, you know, I think Robert, you were talking about this notion that we're all in one world system, one intellectual system, and it's universal now. And I'm thinking a lot of the rural peoples that I've known, and how when I did field work in the 90s, they were still a bit cut off from that universal system. They still were looking at the world from maybe 50%. They could still look at it from a completely different way, but I'm not sure that that's true anymore. I think now everyone's so well connected that we, you know, people can, rural people in China can understand what a European university system is, probably, as well as someone in California. So I just kind of wonder whether we have kind of like our diversity right now is sort of like this spring-loaded diversity that that's gonna play out, and we're not really gonna be as diverse at the end. And I don't know whether that affects the generative capacity of the diversity to challenge the worldview that's shaping it all. And maybe it's not even a question that we need to concern ourselves with too much. I don't know. We have plenty of problems that we do need to resolve, and we have plenty of diversity that is generated out of injustice that probably our generation needs to tackle before we worry about running out of enough diversity and running out of enough problems. Okay, Stephen, and then Roger.
I just bailed out of another presentation by Marcel Gleiser at Dartmouth, who has a really great program. They were talking about the need for diversity to address the issues of climate change and the problems thereby. And they brought an indigenous, professor with an indigenous background, and she was representing the perspective that the American indigenous Indians have with respect to how to take care of the land and so on and so forth. And I think that this guy is kind of, there's a trend towards these kind of things, especially with the impact of the pandemic and the climate change simultaneously. So I think there are definitely people questioning the standard perspective, the kind of reductionist perspective that seems to have led to so many problems. It may be that as we pursue this understanding of what the House is telling us is an important perspective, that we will learn to find a ready audience for our discussions. The other thing I wanted to say is that I want to say that I think Oreskes' book is a kind of extraordinarily powerful way to take the message that we're spending a couple of months talking about Longino's point of view. Oreskes, with her, she's a historian of science, not a philosopher of science, with her background of exploring, fake tobacco science and fake climate science, she kind of applies these ideas or shows how they come to bear in our society in a very dramatic way. And sitting in Harvard with that kind of prestigious position, she really does an impact and does have a kind of popular presentation. So I want to speak highly of Oreskes. I think she's a useful tool for going forward.
Yeah, I really love Oreskes too. I think she's a wonderful writer too. Robert.
I just wanted to offer a brief comment to what you were saying. I think it's a very real question. It's a really critical question. You know, of course, in one sense, there's a natural diversity of temperament, which will always be there. You know, but the drawing an analogy from biology, if you look at, let's say, if you look at the incredible variety of dogs in the world, or Darwin looked at the incredible variety of pigeons that came about from breeding pigeons, that there's this huge amount of what we commonly call junk DNA in our genetic makeup, just DNA that's sitting there doing nothing, which can be drawn on to create a huge variety of forms if you do breeding. In the same way, I think there's this huge variety of what we might call junk cultural DNA in our makeup, which then is ready to come out for a very long time, you know. But when I lived in Kurdistan, there's this really major movement of Kurdish nationalism, and it isn't an aggressive nationalism. It's a reasserting the Kurdish nature. The Kurds have been ill done by, you know, for a long time. So the Kurdish nationalism isn't the nationalism of you know, conquering other people. It's more a nationalism of asserting their own independence. So we'd be on the bus going somewhere on a field trip, you know, 3-hour field trip. But every half hour, suddenly someone turns on this Kurdish music, you know, and the Kurds have a unique music, and then half the bus stands up and starts doing this Kurdish dancing up and down the aisle, you know.
Oh my
Then they
God.
sit down, you know. Half hour later, it comes on again. Everyone all stands up to do this Kurdish line dancing up and down the aisle of the bus. This goes on and on. So a couple of days later in class, these students asked me what kind of music I liked. I said, well, you know, I like classical music, I like rock music, Kurdish music is interesting, I like that. I said, there's one music that I personally don't care much for, and that's rap. They said, what? You don't like rap? Rap is incredible. I thought, oh my gosh, they're as modern as anybody. Despite the Kurdish nationalism, which is an overlay, they're as thoroughly modern as anybody is. Like, they listen to rap music, they listen to, you know, anyway. So for me, it was an eye opener. You know?
I want to be on that bus. That's how I want to travel from now on a Kurdish
But
bus.
these and many of these were girls who wore a hijab because their father insisted on it. So they wore a hijab, you know, and they're into rap music and everything else. So anyway, but yeah, you would have really enjoyed it. If you go to Kurdistan sometime, you'll have a wonderful experience.
Yeah. Roger.
Why is it that I'm thinking of pop culture from the 70s? You're either on the bus or off the bus, or the other one is, I think we're all bozos on this bus. You know, Whitney, I love your question. And I think that, yes, it's for the future. I think the kind of diversity we're concerned about here is social diversity and relations of knowledge and sharing and power and conversation and community, how we build community. In a golden age, how I will have created the context in which the individual can truly flourish. And we will bring a deeper diversity to each other through that flourishing of individuality. And when the mass of the population is actually practicing the independent investigation of the truth, I think science will be utterly transformed, as I think religion will be utterly transformed. So that's a different kind of diversity, or diversity at a whole new level that's only hinted at by the current problems we're having. So I really like your question, and that's my answer.
Yeah, I have to say, I think there's an unfortunate diversity that we have with just family conditions. I don't know, psychological histories. You know, as we keep witnessing these, you know, these people murdering other people, there's always a real, there's a family history that probably for most functioning adults, we look, we hear about that violent person's background and think, whoa, that's really diverse from my experience. That's a striking background. And, I think the golden age for me, one of the, I think, central features of a golden age led by Baha'u'llah's guidance will be the elimination of that diversity, where you have abused children and in all these variety of ways that produce abusive, violent adults. And so,
The dysfunction, yeah, the diversity of dysfunction, yeah.
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 Stephen, and then Todd.
Quickly, a harbinger of change. Deb Haaland, who's half Laguna Indian. I had a girlfriend from Laguna.
Oh.
Is now Secretary of the Interior. Wow.
Yeah.
These are the kind of changes that are starting to happen. Diversity is starting to happen, I think.
Yeah, I just have to plug a side note in there. My cousin, my first cousin, is running for her now open seat.
Really? Oh,
Yeah.
you have a cousin in New Mexico.
Wow.
All right.
To go, yeah.
Name?
Her name is Randy McGinn.
How's that spelled?
First name Randi, last name MC, capital GINN.
Thanks.
It's my first cousin, and she was she's a lawyer. I mean, she was DA of Albuquerque.
So I have to say that New Mexico probably has the greatest diversity of any state in the country.
Yeah.
And it goes back to this very strong, long-lived indigenous culture that's still there. And Hispanic culture from 4.5, 5 centuries ago. And then white American culture in many different forms. And there's a true interaction. True interaction between all of them. And I had the good fortune of growing up there.
Yeah.
Yeah, our family visited there just right before the pandemic, actually, and we all fell in love with the place. There were just so many, the diversity of the indigenous people. We met lots and lots of indigenous people on the trip, and I think that's why we fell in love with the place. And there's so many pueblos, and then we met Navajos, and it was really a vibrant place. Love New Mexico. I know why you talk about it still, Stephen. It's a great place.
Great Mexican food.
Yeah.
Oh, yes.
It has the most apt slogan, Land of Enchantment. That's what it is.
Yeah. Okay, Todd, if you have something to say about New Mexico, chime in.
I have zero to say about New Mexico, except that it sounds good based on what you've said. But in the spirit of Roger's note, I'm just wondering, before I say anything, if Charlotte or Andres wanted to share anything at this point.
Well, the only thing that I could add to was this quote, and I remember reading it or listening to it when Dr. Hatcher was, I think it was one of his talks, and he said, ever since the seeking of preference and distinction came into play, the world has been laid waste. It has become desolate. But I haven't read a quote. So this is from the Universal House of Justice letter. So I haven't heard more about that. But when we're talking about the opposite of being laid waste and becoming desolate is that beautiful spring that we're looking forward to. And so part of that is that worldview that that we are not superior to somebody else. Our notion of what is, like Todd was saying, even the questions that we ask are good questions. And, you know, like a good teacher would never say these are stupid questions, right? They're all good questions. And so if you feel yourself inferior, you don't even want to ask those questions. Like it's only the superior ones who have these good questions and will take us forward and lead us. And anyway, so that was just a point that I wanted to make and bring that quote to everyone's attention.
Can you paste that quote into the chat or
Sure. Yeah, I've got it right here.
in the source? Thank you. Thank you so
Yeah,
much.
and it was the only one I found was from a Universal House of Justice letter. So if anybody knows more about that, but
Okay.
anyway, I'll just post it here.
Andres, did you want to take the floor?
Just briefly, since we were talking about discussing diversity, and I anticipated many conversations about this in some of the people who I approach, I think that we need to be very specific by what we mean by diversity, because on the one hand, you know, people are appalled at the destruction of indigenous cultures across the entire world with the phenomenon of colonialism, but at the exact same time, we are equally appalled at the maintenance of practices such as something as simple as the bullfight in Spanish culture, or honor killings in the Middle East, or the mutilation of young girls in Africa, which are all considered quite normal in many of their respective cultural paradigms. And so we need to be very aware of what valuation of diversity we have that doesn't disintegrate into moral relativism. And so in philosophy, this is actually very simple. In philosophy, you have entire stadiums full of people who don't agree with each other on anything. But, you know, not every consequentialist can be depended on to become Jack Bauer and, you know, torture people to death in order to stop a bomb. And not every deontologist is going to become, you know, an Amish person who will not lift a finger to stop a genocide simply because they don't want to be accountable for anything before God. That's very, very different when you are looking at the exact same situation simply from multiple perspectives, because especially if you start with the idea, the virtue of humility, that you are not inextricably right about every posture that you assume. And so that diversity comes in terms of worldview, because every culture has varying worldviews, and different religious perspectives have varying worldviews. But this doesn't have to descend into relativism. It doesn't have to descend into the moral nihilism that human beings are have intrinsically irreconcilable interests. You simply, in other words, there has to be some kind of a standard by which we say these varying cultural practices, like the different clothing and the different dances and the different instruments, are so valuable, but these other culturally identifying factors, such as the way women are treated, such as the way animals are treated, or the way that children are enculturated, are not all equally good. They're not all equally valid. And so I think we need to start with a metric, first of all, an identifier of what we mean by diversity and what specific diverse elements we're discussing, and then have a metric by which some of them can be considered intrinsically valuable and some only relatively valuable and dispensable. I suppose the summation is that a tradition is not just valuable because it's a tradition. There's something apart from its traditionality that makes it valuable or not valuable.
Was Jack Bauer a reference to 24?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
That's I say that's supposed to. I think my impression of that show, I never actually watched it, is that it's supposed to have an extreme utilitarian paradigm, but the whole plot of the show is made so that less than the most extreme and violent action simply isn't possible in order as a straw man, essentially.
Yep. Agreed. Pretty esoteric.
I am so happy that I'm following Andres because I watched the entire series of 24.
Yeah, didn't it become 48?
and I have to admit that I love the show. And I would agree with the characterization. I think that there was a bit of a tension between the deontological approach and the utilitarian, but the utilitarian usually won out throughout the show. But anyway, that's another discussion. But the other point that I agree with is the emphasis that you're placing on the standards for diversity. That's exactly where I wanted to go as well. And because this is another area where you can look at what Longino is saying and you can see it as a launch pad. And that diversity is critical, but diversity as an end in itself is lacking, is problematic. It's not just about diversity. It's diversity grounded in something that's substantial. It's diversity grounded in unity,
and with a teleological basis.
Exactly, with a teleological basis, exactly, which is where I was going at the beginning of this about teleology is part of this as well. And so for me, this is a direct link to the harmony of science and religion, because religion provides, true religion, through the revelation of Baha'u'llah, provides us with that grounding, that moral grounding for what in fact constitutes an appropriate expression of diversity. Now, obviously, it's going to take a while to figure it out through this action reflection process, but you can't have true diversity without there being, as Andres is saying, this grounding in something that actually gives the expression of diversity its legitimacy. So you have to look to the Word of God in order to find out what in fact that legitimacy is. So that for me is a direct link between what Longino is saying and the one expression of the harmony of science and religion. And the other thing I wanted to say is, which is related, I think, to what you were saying. In feminism, there's an approach called standpoint theory. You might have heard about standpoint theory, which basically says, and I agree with it within this current cultural context, that individuals who are oppressed, and in this case, women and women of color especially who are oppressed, they actually have, in many circumstances, many more valuable things to say about reality than other people do, because their perspective, first of all, has been oppressed and it needs to be heard. But secondly, by virtue of their oppression, they have insights that should be shared and should shed light on the current circumstances. But when you move to more and more of a state in which there's more justice, then that becomes less of an issue. But currently, that's a tremendous issue. And that expression of diversity is critical to bring into the equation in order to shed light. So it's not just about diversity, it's also that certain forms of diversity at this time, given these unfair circumstances, need to be upheld as being significant to shedding light on reality. And then the last thing I'll say is, I believe that there will always be diversity insofar as there's the independent investigation of truth as part of this equation. So that as we, for example, we apply in unity certain expressions of what we understand to be the scientific enterprise, that's always going to generate diversity of experience by virtue of the fact that we engage in independent investigation. But then we bring that diversity of experience back, and that helps to further shape our collective understanding of reality as well. Anyway, the most important thing I said was that Jack Bauer is not the best model, but he's fun to watch.
He's an extreme model. If you want extremities, then you go for somebody like that.
I grew very tired of the violence.
Oh, there's a lot of violence. Okay, that's probably why I haven't
Oh,
watched it. I can't watch
it-
the violence.
We could say that that series, I think, was supposed to be groundbreaking in the kind of things they were able to depict on television. If you're not familiar with it, so yeah, don't start with that.
Okay.
No, it's not. It is not. Well, never mind.
I like groundbreaking. I just can't take any more violence. I think like in the rest of my life, I've just seen too much.
Yeah, we made it through the first 24 hours barely. And then when they continued the story, we signed out.
Okay,
Yeah.
I'd like to submit the comment I made about standpoint theory is a little bit more important than Jack Bauer. So.
Okay. Yeah, but I loved when
Correction.
Andres made that reference. I loved it.
Yeah, I really appreciated Andres, that discussion is one of the central tensions I feel as an academic and as an anthropologist. It's really a central tension in anthropology, whether there is anything that's not relativistic.
Well, my understanding is that in order to be an anthropologist, you just need to assume a relativist standpoint that simply evaluates things impersonally and disinterestedly, and doesn't place any kind of valuation on anything that's observed in the field. It doesn't necessarily mean that there's an intrinsic moral code of relativism that's being adopted as in an objective sense. It's simply a way for an anthropologist to do their job. That was always my impression.
You know, that's a great insight. In practice, I don't think it works out that way. There was actually specifically with genital mutilation. There was a particular anthropologist, psychocultural anthropologist in she's Norwegian, she's Scandinavian, Uni Wicken, who was just appalled at laws in her own country, whether it was Norway or, well, I think it's Norway because her husband was Norwegian. Anyway, what was the issue? Now this is like 20 years old, but there were young women who wanted to get out of genital mutilation, but Norway was returning the women. The women were appealing to the laws of Norway to get out of their families' desire to genitally mutilate them. And Norway was saying, well, no, we need to protect. Well, there was this debate about whether they need to protect the cultural diversity and return these minors to their families, who would then take them out of the country to do this surgery, or whether they had rights of protection from the country. So I guess I haven't fully resolved how to insert my own moral stance without being open to the criticism that I'm just being a Western colonialist.
Ethnocentric.
Yeah,
That's the
ethnocentric,
criticism,
whatever.
really.
Yeah, ethnocentric plus hegemony. I think it's not just ethnocentrism, but it's the hegemony of my position as a white woman, as a middle-class woman, as an American, as a Westerner, that makes my position less strong in stating that. So maybe, you know, I think the indigenous activists in cultures who've been fighting against genital mutilation they just have a greater position. But I think it's a tension. I think we do need to question whether we're defining that morality in an ethnocentric way.
If I might also just throw something in there, and I just want to give a really concrete and practical example about diversity in the practical sciences. And I don't know if any of you have heard of Janine Benyus. You need to read her book. She is a major proponent of the concept of biomimicry, and it is the idea of designing technology and systems, socially and otherwise, based on inspiration from natural systems, ecological and biological and zoological. I suppose the token biomimic would be the Velcro, which was inspired by burrs that stuck to people's clothing and dogs' hairs while they were on walks. I can't remember the gentleman's name who invented the Velcro. And she said that she tells a story where she brought these engineers to a beach, and they would, spend a few days camping and taking pictures. And none of them, really understood what they're supposed to get out of, just walking along the beach, looking at things. So she picks up a seashell. I think these were people, working on things like water systems and the like. And so she picks up a seashell and she says, "Do you know what this is?" And they of course have no idea. She says, "This is calcium carbonate." And automatically, a flag goes up, because that was calcium carbonate was exactly what they dealt with all the time as a problem in plumbing systems and in cleaning pipe work. And so she explained, how it is that a shell could be formed in such a controlled state, by a mollusk being able to control its growth with a protein scaffolding, and to be able to activate or deactivate the protein growth simply by emitting a different chemical enzyme. And then all of a sudden they become extremely interested, and suddenly they were snapping pictures all over the place and looking for solutions. And there actually is, I think, an anti-scaling agent that is actually based on the chemistry that the protein chemistry that a mollusk uses to build its own shell. And so that was her suggestion, is that every engineering team needs to have not just different engineers, but they need to have people like biologists and ecologists in order to bring a fresh perspective to an engineering problem that involves biological systems in order to discover new problem-solving approaches. So that's one way in which diversity strengthens. A diversity of perspectives gives you something that you wouldn't have had otherwise if you had just limited your approaches to a conventional paradigm.
Okay, Stephen, thank you so much, Andres. That was fascinating.
Pleasure.
What's happened? Have we hit pay dirt? I mean, we've been talking about this wonderful book, and it's been all great and so on and so forth. But now we have some, it looks like we have some actionable actionable things to do. All right. Are we going to be able to follow up on this and address these great significant questions? I mean, this has been a highly productive and actionable discussion today.
So what are you going to do about it, Stephen?
Well, I just did it.
No.
At some point, so what we have this course coming up in a while, and then we have all kinds of discussions. I mean, the Universal House of Justice is telling us to engage in discourse as well as social development and community building. What we have here is an example of discussions, at least in my opinion, that work. How do I go talk to people at Google? I mean, I'm in Mountain View. Shouldn't I be able to talk to people at Google, my neighbors? We're striking gold here. What useful? I mean, obviously we have to start to answer these questions and then ground them in the Baha'i writings, But my gosh, it seems to me that we have something to say. I'd love to. I think it takes, I personally think it takes time to develop the capacity to engage in discourse, but we seem to be taking steps in the right direction.
Todd,
Well, I think I agree with that. And I think it would be great if this group or a subset of this group wrote something that could go into JBS, for example, or presented at the conference. But to make it tangible, I actually would highly recommend JBS, you know, because there's a lot of emphasis in the ABS right now with reading groups. I know that this reading group isn't a part of the ABS as Wilmette Institute, but as far as I'm concerned, they're learning how to collaborate, so that's good. So it's all one sort of endeavor. But then another emphasis of the ABS is figuring out how groups of people who are studying like this group is studying can generate writing that can be of service and can help to expand concepts and discourse and that sort of thing. So I noticed that this is being recorded. So maybe it's this, whatever happened today can sort of start to form an article, or the beginnings of an article.
If only our film librarian could get off his butt.
Who is our film librarian?
The thing is that today, I don't know if this is what you planned, Whitney, but so the previous sessions have been trying to understand Longino, which has been great. Today has been about that, but it's also been more that as a platform. Mm-hmm. And I think that going back to Longino is great also, and I'm sure that we should continue in that regard. But this sort of has been a lot of people have expressed a lot of really key insights that sort of draw upon Longino and then take it beyond as well. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think this session has been, I was hoping that we could take a little bit broader view of the book and be a little more creative with it this session. So yeah, maybe we need to sort of look at what we have today and think about, I don't know, which is there a single narrative thread? Is there a single new push beyond it? I don't know.
Another way to ask that is, what is the central question to address? And I think probably we would come up with 10 or 12 or 15 candidates before we really focused on one, because there's such a constellation of issues at work in the areas we're discussing. So we need a way to work that out. Conversationally is one way, but a discussion forum would be another. Todd, we invited everybody from the reading group to attend this, to join in these series. And in fact, several people did with the first one. So there's overlap. I think that's how Whitney got involved here. Mm-hmm. And that's how Farhad came to this.
So one possibility would be to use our upcoming next Wednesday meeting. And so far we've not had a lot of online off video consultation. We could try to change that, but maybe rely upon next meeting, that, you know, to make it happen or something like this. So I think that's a practical way to go about things. If we want to, what are we talking about? We're talking about identifying a central theme that's consistent with what we've been talking about with respect to Longino, and especially today. And then we might, you know, we might get convergence of themes. I mean, it's not necessary that we're going to get 8 different themes. I think we're more likely we're going to get 6 variations on the same theme, and then a couple of others, something
Yeah,
like this.
I think so too. And just you end up phrasing it different ways, and you realize this one resonates more easily than the others. So yeah,
Do we want to try that? Whitney, you're the boss.
Yeah, I guess I'm thinking maybe what we need to do is, well, I don't know. I'm cogitating on it as I'm speaking, and I feel like I need to cogitate on whether, you know, whether our topics congeal into a single written work, and then how would we do that? Do we want to try to cogitate on it together next week with that question of like, okay, what do we have in our hand? I think it's Robert and then Todd.
Actually, Todd was first, I think.
Oh, okay, Todd and then Robert.
I think it would be good. I think maybe we don't have to necessarily say that the entire session is devoted to it, but maybe we can start brainstorming, and it could become part of a regular part of our sessions, that we just sort of spend a bit of time saying, okay, what are some of the major themes? But we don't feel like next week we have to have it all crystallized or anything like that. It just sort of starts to evolve. My personal feeling is that, and this is related to some of the comments, like I do think that it's going to be important to talk about this and the notion of power that Longino gets into, especially towards the end of the book, that would also help to round out some of these concepts somewhat, because there's a direct correlation there, or not direct correlation, there's a relationship there between diversity and power and that sort of thing, and hegemony and ideology. And I think that it's going to be an important thing to bring out before we crystallize things. So I guess my recommendation is we give space at the beginning to start to say, okay, what are some of the major themes that we come up with? We start to note them, but we don't worry about having to finalize anything. And then we just sort of build up a bank of insights. And then over time, we'll start to see whether or not certain themes emerge as more significant than other themes. And then we can use that as a basis for writing. So.
I like that. Robert.
I was going to say something similar, you know, that before we finally do something, I really would like us to finish the book. But it doesn't mean that along the way, you know, if we go straight, if we do nothing but the book until it's finished, we might forget the experience tonight. So to have a mix of both, you know, to do some brainstorming, maybe towards the end, maybe set aside the last 20 minutes or 30 minutes to start with the book, and then have this session, kind of brainstorming session after.
Do people like that idea that we're moving towards partial book, partial brainstorming? Yeah. Okay. Do we like the brainstorming at the end of the discussion? Use the discussion of the book as the warm-up?
I think the answer is yes, because if we start brainstorming and it starts to work, then we won't do the book.
We won't stop.
we'll never make it through.
Yeah.
This is the book that never ends.
We just get slower and slower. They just
Right.
tangentially approach the end, never reaching.
Achilles and the tortoise.
Right.
So can I recommend that for the next two chapters, we don't have to do, like Whitney, you don't have to be plagued by doing a whole bunch of slides.
Okay, that sounds
Maybe,
good to me.
maybe it's just we read them and then we just talk about what we think is important.
Yeah.
I like that.
Yeah.
And then for the chapters 9 and 10, that we maybe get more detailed again.
I agree.
So what are we going to read for next week then?
Chapter 6 then?
Chapter 6?
Yeah.
Try to get through 6 and 7 because
6 and 7. Okay.
there are some, it's kind of one story or
Okay.
two stories, two variations.
Okay. That's good.
Do we discuss both 6 and 7 next week?
Well, let's start out with aiming for 6.
Okay. Yeah, because
Sorry,
we need to stop, cut it off in time to start the
Right.
brainstorming.
Yeah.
I was mistaken. It's not 9 and 10 I was referring to as 8 and 9.
8
Okay.
and 9.
Yeah.
Yeah, 6 and 7 are the two example ones.
Yeah.
I know what you meant. You're muted, Stephen.
Oh,
Stephen, you're muted.
Back to ordinary life for me. I mean, we've been in hyper reality, or maybe Jack Bauer reality, but back to. So see you all later.
okay. Should
Bye.
we end with a prayer, or you want to just take
Sure.
it? Ready?
Sure. That would be nice.
Okay, love you.
Sorry, I didn't mean to like guilt you into a prayer you didn't have time for.
I have a hidden word.
Okay, sounds good.
O Son of Man, veiled in my immemorial being, and in the ancient eternity of my essence, I knew my love for thee. Therefore I created thee, have engraved on thee mine image, and revealed to thee my beauty.
Thank you so much.
Thank you all. Wonderful meeting. We'll
Thank
see
you very
everybody
much.
Bye all.
Good to
next
see everyone.
Wednesday. Yeah.
Thank you again, Whitney.
You're
And
welcome.
Todd, that was very good what you brought up. That was really good.
Nice to be with everybody.
Yeah.